My name's Anne Chappell. I'm the USV Brunel Coordinator, so that's been my role as one of the 7 partners in the programme. I'm based in the Education Department there, and that's really been really very interesting, and it's particularly interesting for us in relation to what we're doing now in the panel, because the panellists that I'm about to introduce you to come from a range of different places and spaces, and that's been one of the really very exciting things about the project, is people coming together who come from different research backgrounds and different spaces for thinking, and the kinds of dialogue that that's generated for us has been really valuable in terms of our work. So what I wanted to do was to very briefly introduce each of our panellists, and they are each going to speak for 5 minutes. So we've changed the structure in terms of the experience we've had first thing, because what we'd like to do in this panel is generate more discussion, and we have some questions and some points for provocation that we will throw over as we get to the end of the panel in order to generate much discussion before we go into lunch, where we'll then have a lengthy break to be able to talk about all the kinds of questions and comments and thoughts and views that we've had over the course of the morning. So thank you in advance for your participation in this session. Much appreciated. So 4 colleagues to introduce to you, and I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then each of them will speak to you around the topic that they're focusing on. So colleagues listed behind me. So Juana Callejo, forgive me, my pronunciation, not all right, who is based at the university, the Autonomous University in Barcelona. And the kind of work that Juan has been involved in is around women and power, vulnerability, accountability. So she's going to have some really interesting things, as the rest of the panel are, to say about the kind of work that we're thinking about today. Mara Martini is a psychologist and works in work and organisation, but is interested in things around gender stereotyping and violence, but also stress and well-being in organisational context, which of course is very interesting in those other questions that relate to the material around sexual violence. We have Antigone Liberaki, who is based at Pantheon University in Greece, and her work is around economics and policy and feminist economics, but also has an involvement and interest in politics, having worked as an MP. And then finally, Alison Phipps, who is at Sussex and works in gender studies, which those of you from the UK will know well, has done a lot of work around the work going on in universities with student unions and organisations, and has been most recently involved in this project, but also some work around changing university cultures, which, given the previous panel, is obviously really critical in the kind of work that this relates to. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everybody today. Our question is around changing campus cultures to create more open and supportive spaces for survivors. And we've got a range of different ideas to share. They're up there behind me. But thinking about protocols, thinking about rates, thinking about the public and the political rather than the personal and the private, and then also the challenges around change in neoliberal universities. So you can see we've got a lot to pack into 20 minutes. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Juana.
Switch between PowerPoint. Yes, because I have this in my computer. Good morning. Thank you to the organization for inviting me to be here with you. I come from Barcelona. The University of Autonomous of Barcelona is the second biggest university in Barcelona, the full public university. It's a very big university with almost 40,000 students and 3,000 teachers. It's a university, I think, that it's one of the most interested in violence, sexual violence. And I have been working in this subject for a long time. but almost related to communication. I am a teacher from gender and communication. But last year, in November, just this month, I was appointed as a new director of the observatory of the university. So this last year, I have been working with the protocol against gender-based violence at our university. We have the second, yeah. At the observatory, as Barbara and Isaskun said before, is something like the equality unity in the university. We have a framework, a legal framework in Spain. I think it's quite well. I think it's quite good. We have three main laws for all the state of Spain. The first law is 2004. The name exactly is the general law against gender-based violence. So this is the first main framework that we have to consider it. The second law is 2007 equality law between men and women, and this is a general law in Spain. And we have in Catalonia two equality Catalan law between men and women from 2015. So I think, honestly, that our framework, the legal framework, is quite good. But not always the law is accomplished. So I think the legal work, the legal framework is better than the reality. In our university, in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, we have almost four. We have in the third action plan for equality between men and women, started in 2013 and finished this year. One of the most important goals of this third action plan is fight against gender-based violence. Oh, to me. So, 5 minutes, yes. So, well, we have this protocol. This protocol can be activated by students, teachers, and administrative staff. The process takes a month. This protocol, this is a protocol closure in English. Almost all for Erasmus students and for foreigners students that came to Barcelona to study. But this is a protocol we want to publish, to give publicity to this protocol, and all the students, teachers, and staff can activate it if they are in this situation. The commission is formed from 4 people, one person from the legal service, another person from the psychology service, another person from the staff preventive service, and one person from the observatory that almost the time I am the person of the observatory. We try to do a lot of campaigns against violence, and this that I am showing are some of the most important campaigns that we have done. I should explain more and deeply all the process, but I have just 1 minute, so it's very difficult to explain in 1 minute all what we have done. But this is our main campaign. For example, this is the promotion, the publicity, the advertising of our last campaign. All the year or every year we have at least one campaign against gender-based violence, and I think people at the university is knowing now more our protocol. Well, I would like to explain how the protocol has functioned until this, but I don't have time anymore. So this is all. Thank you for your attention.
Hi to everyone. I'm Mara Martini I am a research fellow from the University of Turin. And can I have my, thank you. Okay, my presentation, my very short presentation is about the diffusion of rape myths, false representation about gender violence in the two universities between among students of the university and of the Polytechnic of Turin. In Italian cultural, there are a lot of false representation of rape. So we was interested to understand how much there are spread in the specific context of university. So we send to all the students of our university a link to fill in a questionnaire. 4,027 students fill in the online questionnaire, and we asked them several things, but among the others, two groups of questions, two batteries, two scales were about, can you change this? Okay. About rape myths, and that are false representation justifying gender violence or minimizing the seriousness of racism. And another scale was about bystander efficacy, that is the intention to intervene to contrast violence when it is happening. In this slide, you can see students' answer. Their agreement with each of these 22 item statements that express a false representation. They are grouped in four big myths that are: she asked for it, he didn't mean to, it wasn't really rape, and she lied. You can see that students' agreement is not so high, but you can't avoid to note that about 20% or more, that is one student in 5 or in 4 students, are agree with statement as when girls are raped, it's often because of the way they say no as a volunteer, or when guys rape, it is usually because of the strong desire for sex, and it is quite worrying. On the other hand, we can see that about their intention to intervene, answers are show a quite high values, because on a scale between 0 and 10, all values are quite high. But we can see that towards more subtle forms of violence, as a joke about a woman's body, is lower. The intention to intervene is clearly lower. Very interesting, in my opinion, is the next analysis that show as there is a strong correlation. The two asterisks means that there is a very meaningful and strong correlation between the intention to intervene, to contrast any form of violence, and the disagreement with each of these myths. But we can say if we are able to change more and more this believing, probably more spread can be also the intention to intervene to contrast, even if we are not directly involved as the bystander literacy, bystander studies express, and we can see it in a group of studies in USA, by Banyard, for example. We think that it's very important to try to invest on primary prevention, changing of cultural beliefs before the violence is happened. Okay.
Okay, I'm very happy to be here and sharing some views with you. I'll try to be provocative as I was asked. So I'll start straight away saying that I come from a society and an academic milieu where there exist lots of narratives on general and societal issues. Such narratives are used liberally, happily, and without restraint from many people. And to give you a few examples, the anti-globalization narrative, the anti-neoliberalism narrative, the anti-EU narrative, the anti-crisis narrative, anti-police narrative as well. Big issues, political, public. What we lack, however, is an understanding of more personal and private experiences and the capacity to link ideas and issues of liberty and liberation to everyday lived experience. And this is why in Greece we have all sorts of institutional regulations for all sorts of things, but we don't have anything, as Alexandra Zabur remarked earlier, about how to deal with sexual violence university level. So when the issue of sexual violence is raised in the university, one gets typically two reactions, very characteristic of the Greek situation, both of them. The first is, you do not have the right to interfere and to police the way I conduct my private affairs. I'm rebelling against authorities. You cannot tell me how I'm gonna flirt with whoever I want to, whenever I want to. So this is one issue that somehow is used to mask and conceal the most traditional and horrible and reactionary attitudes. The second kind of reaction you get is the Chinese famine type of fallacy. Oh yes, of course, sexual violence is a horrible thing, but you know, compared to what's happening in Pakistan, for instance, or in places of Africa, or in the moon, the size of the problem we are facing here is not that important, whereas we are pressed with more important issues like combating the crisis, fighting against the bad guys, and in general. So we end up doing nothing because the scale of the problem is not evaluated as being enough to attract collective action. So let me, thank you. Let me also, instead of criticizing everybody else, include also a self-critical note that the tradition of the old feminist movement, old in the sense of ages, in which I also belong, where we used to be very much focused on social issues gender seen as the social consequences of, and never the array of choice that people could have in their sexualities. And my feeling is that we feminists in Greece are partly to be criticized for the total lack of interest and focus on personal matters. So in the end, I wonder, can we raise gender-based violence issues without dealing with freedom to choose sexual identities? Thank you.
I don't have a PowerPoint either, I'm low tech. But I do feel like breaking into song. Does anybody mind if I do a couple of Aerosmith covers? No. Showing my age, don't lie. Or the younger ones don't. So thank you very much, and thanks very much to all the other speakers for highlighting lots of different issues which speak to the phenomenon of culture in our universities. I've been working on sexual harassment and violence in UK universities for about 12 years now, and I've done a lot of thinking about culture. And actually I think in the UK we always have the opposite problem, in that our discourse can sometimes be too focused on the personal and not enough on the bigger picture, and Ruth kind of highlighted that in her talk as well. So I started out researching lab culture amongst students, and I think the other speakers have highlighted similar issues around gendered cultures, which express themselves through things like rape myths and make it very difficult to implement progressive policies and procedures. And more recently, I've been looking at how sexual harassment and violence are shaped by the cultures of the neoliberal university, although we do also have a similar phenomenon in this country by which the critique of neoliberalism is also used as an excuse for bad behaviour. But I have looked at how the structures and cultures of neoliberalism and the market rationalities of neoliberalism situate issues of sexual harassment and violence within what I call reckonings, in which the institutional impact of disclosure is projected and twisted up, and in which the personal can often be lost. So this produces what I've called institutional airbrushing, in which an emphasis on the appearance of the university takes precedence over staff and student welfare. So institutional airbrushing takes two main forms. Either issues are denied, concealed, minimised, and settled quietly, or when it's not possible to do that, sometimes after the media has been involved, the perpetrators themselves is airbrushed from the institution and it's made to appear as if they were never there. And the key point for me in both of these things is that the impact of disclosures on the future value of the institution is more troubling than the issues of harassment and violence that they reveal. And I think all of the speakers on this panel have reminded us that the institution is not a neutral space. So that's a key premise for my work in this area. Universities are patriarchal, they're also racist, classist, and other things as well. So they can't be looked to unproblematically to undo the harms of those systems. And there are also intersectional questions for me around who is more likely to be deemed worthy of protection when the institution does intervene, and also who is more likely to be treated harshly by punitive policies and processes. So for me, trying to implement progressive policies in a problematic culture, e.g. one in which rape myths are pervasive, or one which is institutionally racist, is like trying to cut wood against the grain or trying to get water to flow upstream. And policy change can also be performed for market benefit in cultures dominated by the market, which has problematic results. So a recent report by Warwick academics on Athena Swan, which is our UK gender equality accreditation exercise, revealed that bad practice is often covered up rather than dealt with for the purpose of applications. And furthermore, as Sarah Ahmed has argued in relation to race equality schemes, when accreditations like this are awarded, they become a means to deny the existence of a problem or to claim that the problem's been solved. So in other words, equality initiatives themselves can become tools for institutional airbrushing within dysfunctional cultures. And I'm not necessarily saying that institutions can't change. I've done a lot of work on changing institutional cultures, which we can talk about in the questions. But I think that institutional cultural change is a long process which requires commitment, deep thinking, and also the capacity to be vulnerable on the part of individuals and the institution itself. So for many student and staff survivors, the university is what perpetrates the second rape that exacerbates their trauma. And the perpetration of this second rape is a function of the institutional refusal to be vulnerable, to admit weakness, to tackle problems head on. So similar to the first rape, which is often about the perpetrator's desire for power and control, in the second rape, the institution denies the problem and closes ranks to protect itself from market risk. So my question to you and for this panel, for the discussion in a minute, is how can we work to change institutional cultures in marketised higher education? Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. So thanks to the panellists at this point, but I have encouraged the panellists to, join in the discussion with each other as much as in response to questions. The 4 provocations are up behind us, so we're encouraging you to think very particularly in relation to these provocations, but also to ask questions that relate directly to them. They arise from the presentations that the panellists have given, which I'm sure you'll agree, we've managed to pack an awful lot there into 4 lots of 5 minutes, so my thanks very much to colleagues for doing that. But given us a lot to think about, we have about 20 to 25 minutes before lunch to be able to discuss some of these ideas. So with a roving mic, which is very good news, thank you, Joaquin will arise at your side should you wish to say anything. I've just opened the floor to any questions that colleagues might have. You need some roller skates or something, don't you, for this job?
I can just speak very loudly.
Can you? And I'll repeat your question. Yeah.
Rose Gibson, University of Bath. I've got a question for Alison. I feel that in the UK, the things you're talking about slightly improved over the last couple of years, especially with the education funds. And institutions are being more open to talking about sexual harassment, and the fear of that has reduced slightly. I'm really looking forward to the 1752 report coming out, and I'm worried that it might cause institutions to put their barriers back up with it being staff to students. And I just wondered if you had any advice on encouraging institutions to continue to be open-minded and forward-thinking with that particular issue.
Okay, so just to repeat the question or the comment. The context in the UK has changed significantly over recent times, and universities are much more open to activities being undertaken in this area. But there's a group in the UK called the 1752 group, whose work is around staff-student sexual violence and inappropriate sexual behaviour, and their report will be published soon. And Rose's question is, how can we encourage universities to keep the dialogue open rather than shutting down when a report like that comes out, which will indicate that there are some difficulties and problems in the institution. Is that, yeah? Okay.
Thank you. I think that's a really useful question, and I'm not sure I have all the answers. And it seems to be a bit of a cyclical process, so you can't always predict what institutions are going to do. But I think that we do need to work deeply and constructively with institutions. And I do think we need to be careful about how we use the media in relation to, certainly in this country where the issue has moved on quite a bit, because the media are a law unto themselves. And sometimes their interventions can be quite unhelpful. For instance, they seem to labour under the misapprehension that more reports means more assaults, whereas more reports might just mean that you have better systems in place for capturing what's going on. So I think the more we can work with our institutions and almost perform a reassurance type role about these types of things, the better. I not everybody in the room will agree with this, but I am deeply opposed to naming and shaming of perpetrators. I don't think it's helpful. I think it creates a culture of fear, and I don't think fear gets institutions or individuals to change in particularly helpful ways. So I think we need to think about our own integrity as well when we're engaging with these issues. And also the cultural work that we need to do in institutions will hopefully help them to stop hiding under the bed when things do emerge, because that response is not working anymore. And I'm not sure whether it will work as and when the next scandal breaks because of the power of social media. It seems as though this juggernaut is not going to be stopped by universities diving. Does that kind of answer your question? I don't have all the answers.
I would like to say that I think that in Spain there is much more awareness about this problem, about this sexual violence. I think people is very worried. It's worried because in Spain we have at least 50 women murdered every year. And the street and the people in general are much more interested by this problem. A few months ago there was an agreement of state an agreement to fight without violence, sexual violence. It's not perfect, of course. We need much more commitment, institutional commitment of the government. But I think there are a very lively movement in the social network between women, young women, and a group of women. Also, there are a reaction again, also that we can see in the social network. But I think in the academy, at least in my university. For example, students are now debating a code of ethics for the association against gender-based violence and harassment. So I think it's a good moment to think about and to worry about this problem. We have many problems already, but I think it's a good moment to fight, and many people are worried about this.
So I suppose it's really interesting there, isn't it, in terms of these pressures that come from different places and the impact that will have on then the way universities will have to respond. Rose, thank you. Other questions?
I just want to reply to that. I'm Emma Chapman from the 1752 group. We're very keen on keeping this as a self-propelling movement, so we don't just stop by asking universities to accept there's a problem, but actually by embedding the accountability within the entire university framework, so as soon as possible tying it to, for example, funding agencies like the Medical Council requiring a Phoenix Swan Silver to go forward, and then, well, first of all, you've got to have harassment and bullying within Phoenix Swan, for example, but actually tying it into funding. Accreditation for physics programmes we're looking at the minute with the Institute of Physics to actually say, well, if you can't guarantee the safety of your students, why on earth should we be accrediting you to teach them? So it's very much about making ourselves redundant and making sure the universities keep the spotlight on themselves. One of the other branches we're looking at is removing the confidentiality around the processes. So it's not on the students to have to go to BuzzFeed, it's not on whistleblowers to risk their careers, it's on the universities to not publicise but accept the outcome of a disciplinary process, make that transparent, and therefore the spotlight should actually.
Thank you. I think what's really important to share there for European colleagues is that because the way in which research funding is organised in the UK, and because of the research excellence framework activities and the importance of that in the university's status and standing, and in people's individual academic careers, tying things to those codes of conduct that are associated to research in this context is a really powerful thing to do. Because research funding is very important and it's high stakes for universities. So thank you. And would you want to comment on
I think it's that one. I would like to respond to your questions, the question you raised before. saying how can we deal with issues of sexual violence in universities at the time when universities are closing ranks and are trying to protect themselves in order to have a good name in the market. This reminds me exactly what happens with families. Families are closing ranks all the time. They are protecting both victims and perpetrators. They are cooperating here to push the problem. Sometimes it's a big problem out of the country. So why don't we use some of the examples of changing families in order to, you know, use it in university law?
I'm Isabella Santamaria. I work for London School of Economics. I just have a question, not relating to a certain institution, but relating to a culture of higher education here in the United Kingdom. Although there is a lot of talk and there is legislation and there are policies in place and way to report sexual harassment or rape and so on, there is also a culture in higher education of protecting certain individuals in certain positions in higher education and not others. So when you report something, if that individual is bringing £30 million research funding to the institution, it will be hush-hush and nobody will talk about it. However, if it was a woman who was accused of sexual harassment or somebody who is not bringing that much research money into the institution, it would be a witch hunt and that person will be made as a, oh look, we are doing what we need to do and this is an example of what we've done. Is there any movement or this research could do something about institutions needing to look at every individual and not protect certain people and not others?
It's quite interesting in relation to the talk that Rana gave there, because she was talking about the difference between the legal framework, which we could also say policy framework, and reality, which is the point that you're making.
Well, I would like to say that what that I said before, we have good laws. If a law applied in the good sense, I think it would be better to fight against sexual violence. But, as she said, I think that the culture won't change if we can change the media. Video clips, movies, advertising, all this imaginary moves to sexual activity. So how can we fight against sexual violence if we have all the imagery in the communication that shows sexualization of women? This is very difficult to do. I don't know how to do.
And it's also connected to Alison's points about the neoliberal university and the point earlier on about research.
So this one. Yeah, I mean, some people are reckoned up differently to others, aren't they? You know, some people are worth more than others within the internal economy of the university. And I don't know what the answer is to that, apart from to say that the policies should apply to everyone. But it's very, very difficult to do. And one of the questions that we ask in our project, Changing University Cultures, is how can we stop universities from just defaulting to market-based calculations when there's a disclosure of sexual harassment and violence. And I don't know what the answer is, because some people are worth more to the institution, aren't they? They should be, but they aren't. Yeah. Anybody else? Any ideas? Go on.
Yes, just to bring in, the cultural difference perspective. But for instance, in Greece, it might not be let's say the purchase of an individual in their institution might not be linked to their market value, but it might be linked to their political value. So, even I think naming that this is not it's not an absolute value. So since different cultures and different institutions attribute value to different kinds of social goods, let's say, or resources, I think we can start from that point to start reconstructing that value. So I think there needs to be a kind of, let's say, discourse that deconstructs the value system in different institutions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And some of the other work we've done with the universities is on their actual values. So to say, what do you value? And maybe if we can raise the profile of some of these other values, these civic values rather than economic ones, then the balance would start to look slightly different. Because if actually part of the draw of the university is that we have strong community values, we treat each other in a certain way, we educate young people to become good citizens in these ways, then suddenly the professor who was bringing in £30 million but not behaving according to those values starts to look slightly different. So I think that there might be something there. Because it's all very well to say they shouldn't be worth more, let's get rid of them, but I don't think that that's a particularly effective approach.
I think the introduction of the Teaching Excellence Framework is going to be really, really interesting, because that's going to change the way that universities have to talk about themselves. The metrics are still crude metrics, but will be measured on student experience, and of course this relates in part to student experience.
And it has.
And that, yeah, well, yeah.
I'm fully aware that when universities need to make the calculation of the pros and cons and sell their market to their product to the market, they try to hide the unattractive aspects. However, the alternative, not having anybody evaluating you and having a captive student population that just pass some impartial exams and they end up at your classroom without ever choosing you or considering you or ever evaluating you, this could be even worse.
Yes.
No? Okay.
So we have time for two more. Colleague here and then the colleague over here, sorry.
Yeah, I want to answer Isabel's question around what can we do around people who carry so much research funding in universities that are worried about pressing on and investigating those people. And actually I think it's about the grant funders as well. And I think they should have strong narratives on this and strong procedures for investigating the people who they're giving money to, and that should all be connected. And I also think that people like HEFCE should be stepping in, where if a university has been brave enough to dismiss someone who carries a huge research grant, how a HEFCE supporting that university to have taken that first step.
So again, just for European partners, HEFCE is the Higher Education Funding Council, so they have a significant remit in the work of the university, and of course now we have an office for students, which again, in relation to the TEF and the kind of changing climate, is going to be really interesting, I think. So one final question, comment over here. Thank you.
Hello. I'm quite curious about the experience of the European universities and non-UK universities in terms of to what extent wider media influence the response of the universities when there is a sexual violence, sexual harassment incident within university premises. In my experience in the UK, media very much shape and sometimes dictates the university's response, especially when the particular incident in question is very much publicized in the collective consciousness.
Very difficult to understand who influences who, because it's a virtuoso dangerous circle, because sometimes media influences common opinion, and it is in this way is shaped it. But I try to tell very quickly something that happens inside this project, because we diffused in our final moment after of the training, it was a plenary session. We fused the results of our students' lesson, and the day after the newspaper wrote something very strange, very different from the things we said during the session. So it is very difficult to create a language that communicate the things in a way that is safe, I think. But I think also that if we are strong in naming things, naming violence as a violence, not as a joke or as a not important things, I think we can little change things.
Just come in on the issue of media. I think media can be blamed from now till eternity. There are many grounds to do so. I don't think it's a very useful way of going about it. I think that, of course, criticizing media images can be a good advocacy point, but in reality, we need to produce images and narratives that are strong enough and attractive enough to move along on their own, and not wait for the media to do our work for us. So, in a sense, media in Greece, for instance, reserve their interest of the private life of individuals only in the political sphere, but they somehow live along normal people. The only case of sexual violence that really hit the first pages of the newspaper was a couple of years ago, about a young male gay student who was from Crete, and I'm saying this because it's a very macho culture, for whoever of you are acquainted with this particular island, and he was studying elsewhere, away from home in Yanina, equally aggressive macho culture, and he was so relentlessly bullied that in the end he took his own life. And when there is a dead body, suddenly it becomes an issue. Nobody knows exactly how to deal with this issue, and then it dies out in a few days. I think that this pretty much sums up what happens when you don't have a narrative linking personal freedom, personal life, personal identities with broader narratives of values.
Thank you. So, if we return to our kind of question, which we were set for this panel, which was around changing campus cultures, in the end, we come back to context and culture in a much broader sense, which resonates with the panel this morning, and I'm sure will resonate with some more conversations later on. The place of the personal versus the public and the private and the political and the way in which those interact. And of course, when we talk about politics and political and policy, we're talking about many, many different levels. And there are clearly some really, really interesting and very, very important things that we have to think about in all of our contexts as contexts change and policy decisions are made and the ways in which we can respond to those. So can I thank you all very much for your comments, questions, thoughts, considerations. I hope people are tweeting furiously because I'm desperate to kind of read the things that people have been thinking while we've been talking. I'd like to thank very much the members of the panel. I feel very privileged to have been asked to chair this because it's been really fascinating. So thank you very, very much indeed. If you could thank